She was just cleaning the Apache's machine gun until the pilot saw the patch, and froze. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully cleaned the M230 chain gun mounted beneath the H-64 Apache helicopter. The afternoon sun blazed down on the tarmac at Fort Hood, Texas, where the aircraft maintenance bay buzzed with the constant activity of mechanics, technicians, and support personnel, keeping America's most lethal attack helicopters mission ready. At 28 years old, Maria had been working on military aircraft for 8 years, ever since she enlisted straight out of high school in El Paso. She was known throughout the maintenance squadron for her meticulous attention to detail, her encyclopedic knowledge of helicopter systems, and her ability to diagnose problems that stumped more experienced mechanics. But most of all, she was known for keeping to herself and never talking about her past. Maria wore the standard Army combat uniform, but on her right shoulder was a small patch that she had sewn on herself, a patch that told a story she had never shared with anyone at Fort Hood. It was faded from years of washing, the colors dulled by time and wear, but the design was still clearly visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. As she worked methodically on the Apache's weapons system, checking each component with the precision of someone who understood that pilots' lives depended on her work, Maria had no idea that she was about to be discovered by the one person who would recognize the significance of that patch and the extraordinary story it represented. Captain Jake "Viper" Mitchell was walking across the tarmac after a training flight, his flight suit still damp with perspiration from 2 hours in the cockpit. As one of the Army's most experienced Apache pilots, with 3 combat tours and over 200 flight hours, Jake had developed an almost supernatural awareness of everything that happened around his aircraft. He noticed every detail, every person who worked on his helicopter, every small change in procedure or personnel. But when Jake Mitchell looked down and saw Maria Santos cleaning his aircraft's main gun, something about her posture, her movements, and especially the patch on her shoulder made him stop dead in his tracks. His face went pale, his hands began to shake, and his eyes filled with tears as he stared at the small piece of fabric that told a story he thought he would never encounter again. The patch that Maria Santos wore represented one of the most classified and dangerous missions in recent military history. Mission that had saved Jake Mitchell's life and the lives of his crew 5 years ago in Afghanistan. But according to official records, everyone involved in that mission had died. Everyone except the mysterious helicopter mechanic who had appeared out of nowhere, fixed their damaged aircraft under enemy fire, and disappeared before anyone could learn her name. Jake Mitchell was staring at a ghost, and that ghost was about to change everything he thought he knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the hidden stories of America's unsung warriors. The year was 2018, and Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan was under constant threat from Taliban forces who had been launching increasingly sophisticated attacks against American positions. Captain Jake Mitchell and his crew were conducting daily combat missions in their AH-64 Apache, providing close air support for ground troops and hunting Al-U targets across the treacherous mountain terrain. Jake's aircraft had been hit by small arms fire during a mission to support a special forces unit that was pinned down by enemy fighters. The damage was severe enough to force an emergency landing at a remote outpost that was barely more than a collection of concrete barriers and a small helicopter landing pad. The outpost was manned by fewer than 20 soldiers and had no aviation maintenance capabilities. With his aircraft grounded and enemy forces closing in on their position, Jake Mitchell thought he was looking at a death sentence. The Apache's transmission had been damaged, its hydraulic systems were leaking, and the electrical systems were failing. Without immediate repairs, the helicopter would never fly again, and everyone at the outpost would be overrun by the approaching Taliban forces. That's when she had appeared. Nobody knew her name, nobody knew where she came from, and nobody could explain how a lone helicopter mechanic had somehow made it to their isolated outpost with a bag full of spare parts and tools. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, Hispanic, and she spoke very little English. But she knew Apache helicopters better than anyone Jake had ever met. Working under enemy fire, with mortar rounds exploding around the landing pad, and small arms fire crackling overhead, the mysterious mechanic had performed what could only be described as a miracle. In less than 3 hours, she had completely rebuilt the damaged transmission, repaired the hydraulic leaks, and restored all electrical systems to full functionality. But the most incredible part was what happened next. As Jake prepared to take off and evacuate the outpost, he had looked back to thank the mechanic who had saved their lives. She was gone, vanished without a trace, as if she had never been there at all. The official reports of the mission made no mention of the mystery mechanic. The Army classified the entire operation, and Jake was ordered never to discuss what had happened at the outpost. But he never forgot the woman who had saved his life, and he never stopped wondering who she was and what had happened to her. Jake had tried for years to find some trace of the mystery mechanic, but every investigation hit dead ends. The Army claimed no knowledge of any female helicopter mechanics operating in that region at that time. Special Operations Command had no records of any mechanics being deployed to support the mission. It was as if the woman who had saved Jake's life had been erased from history. Now, 5 years later, Jake Mitchell was staring at Staff Sergeant Maria Santos and seeing something that made his blood run cold. The patch on her shoulder was not standard issue. It was a small, custom-made piece that bore the insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the elite Night Stalkers, a unit that conducted the most dangerous helicopter missions in the world. But more specifically, it was a patch that Jake had only seen once before, worn by the mystery mechanic who had saved his life in Afghanistan. The patch bore a unique design, a wrench crossed with a rotor blade, surrounded by the words "Death Before Malfunction," the unofficial motto of the Night Stalkers maintenance crews. Jake Mitchell realized that he was looking at the ghost who had saved his life, and that Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had a story that the Army had apparently decided to bury. But Jake wasn't going to let her disappear again without getting the answers he had been seeking for 5 years. The question was, why had the Army covered up her role in the mission, and what had happened to Maria Santos after she vanished from that Afghan outpost? Captain Jake Mitchell approached Maria Santos slowly, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. The patch on her shoulder was unmistakable. It was identical to the one worn by the mystery mechanic who had saved his life in Afghanistan. But according to every official record, that mission had resulted in total casualties among the maintenance personnel. Maria Santos shouldn't exist. Staff Sergeant Santos, Jake called out, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotions churning inside him. Could I speak with you for a moment? Maria looked up from her work on the Apache's gun system, her dark eyes meeting Jake's with the kind of steady gaze he remembered from that night in Afghanistan. She set down her tools and stood at attention, but Jake could see something flicker across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe fear. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" Maria replied, her voice steady but guarded. Jake pointed to the patch on her shoulder, his hand trembling slightly. "That patch? Where did you get it?" Maria's entire body went rigid. Her eyes darted around the maintenance bay, checking to see who might be listening to their conversation. When she looked back at Jake, her expression had transformed from professional courtesy to something much more complex, part defiance, part terror, and part resignation. Sir, I'm not sure what you're asking about, Maria said carefully. It's just a maintenance patch. But Jake Mitchell had spent too many years in combat to be fooled by evasive answers. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private. Forward Operating Base Chapman, October 15, 2018. My Apache took hits and made an emergency landing. Transmission was shot, hydraulics were failing, and we were surrounded by Taliban forces. Then a mechanic appeared out of nowhere and fixed everything in 3 hours while mortars were falling around us. That mechanic was wearing the exact same patch you're wearing right now. Maria Santos went completely pale. For a moment, Jake thought she might collapse or run away. Instead, she glanced around the maintenance bay again, and then moved closer to Jake, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sir, I don't know what you think you remember, but there's no record of any mission like that. According to the Army, I've never been to Afghanistan. I've been stationed at Fort Hood for my entire enlistment. My personnel file will confirm that. Jake stared at her in disbelief. That's impossible. I know what I saw. You saved my life and the lives of everyone at that outpost. How can there be no record? Maria Santos looked directly into Jake's eyes, and what he saw there shocked him more than anything that had happened during his combat tours. It was the look of someone who had been forced to deny her own heroism, someone who had been ordered to pretend that her most significant achievement had never occurred. Captain Mitchell, Maria said quietly, sometimes the Army decides that certain missions never happened. Sometimes the people who participated in those missions are reassigned, reclassified, and given new histories. Sometimes heroes are told to forget they were ever heroes. The implications of what Maria was saying hit Jake like a physical blow. The Army had covered up the entire mission, including Maria's role in saving multiple American lives. They had apparently given her a false service record and stationed her at Fort Hood under orders to never acknowledge what she had done. But why? Jake demanded. Why would they cover up what you did? You saved lives. You performed miracles under fire. You should have received the highest decorations the Army can award. Maria Santos smiled sadly, and for the first time, Jake saw the woman he remembered from that night in Afghanistan. Brave, competent, and utterly committed to keeping soldiers alive. Captain, you know how the Army works. Sometimes what really happened isn't as important as what the official story needs to be. Sometimes individual heroism gets in the way of bigger political or strategic objectives. And sometimes people like me are ordered to disappear so that people like you can never ask the questions you're asking right now. Jake Mitchell felt his anger building as he realized the full scope of what had been done to Maria Santos. She had risked her life to save his crew, had performed her duty with extraordinary courage and skill, and had been rewarded with official erasure of her service record. This is wrong, Jake said, his voice filled with righteous fury. What you did in Afghanistan was the most incredible display of courage and competence I've ever witnessed. The Army can't just pretend it never happened. Maria Santos looked at Jake with an expression that combined gratitude and fear. Sir, with respect, the Army can do whatever it wants. And right now, what it wants is for me to service helicopters at Fort Hood and never talk about Afghanistan. I have orders, and I follow orders. But Jake Mitchell was not prepared to let the Army bury Maria Santos's heroism a second time. He had spent 5 years wondering about the mystery mechanic who had saved his life, and now that he had found her, he was going to make sure her story was told, regardless of what official policies stood in his way. The confrontation that was about to unfold would force both Maria Santos and Jake Mitchell to choose between following orders and fighting for the truth, a choice that would change both of their lives forever. Over the next several days, Captain Jake Mitchell began conducting his own investigation into Maria Santos's official service record, and what he discovered was more disturbing than he had imagined. According to her personnel file, Staff Sergeant Santos had enlisted in 2016 and had spent her entire career at Fort Hood. There was no record of deployment to Afghanistan, no combat service record, and no indication that she had ever been trained in the specialized maintenance procedures required to service aircraft under combat conditions. But Jake knew what he had seen. He had watched Maria Santos perform repairs under enemy fire that would have challenged the most experienced mechanics in ideal conditions. Her knowledge of Apache systems had been encyclopedic, her work had been flawless, and her courage under fire had been extraordinary. None of that could have been learned from peacetime maintenance work at Fort Hood. Jake began reaching out to contacts within the intelligence community, Special Operations Command, and veteran networks to see if anyone else had encountered the mystery mechanic from FOB Chapman. What he discovered was a pattern of similar stories. Special Forces units across Afghanistan reporting encounters with an unidentified female mechanic who would appear at remote outposts, perform miraculous repairs under impossible conditions, and then vanish without a trace. The stories were always the same: critical aircraft failures, impossible repair challenges, enemy fire, and then a young Hispanic woman with extraordinary mechanical skills who could fix anything. But every official report of these incidents made no mention of any outside maintenance support. It was as if Maria Santos had been systematically erased from the historical record of the Afghanistan War. Meanwhile, Maria Santos was becoming increasingly nervous about Jake Mitchell's questions and his obvious investigation into her background. She had been ordered to maintain her cover story and never acknowledge her classified service record, but she was beginning to realize that Jake Mitchell was not going to simply accept the official version of events. The breakthrough came when Jake managed to contact Master Sergeant Tom Bulldog Peterson, who had been the senior NCO at FOB Chapman during the October 2018 incident. Peterson had been medically retired after losing his leg to an ID explosion 6 months after the Apache repair mission, and he was now living in Colorado with no remaining ties to active duty Army politics. "Captain Mitchell," Peterson said during their phone conversation, "I remember that night like it was yesterday. We were getting hammered by Taliban mortars, your bird was shot to hell, and we all thought we were going to die. Then this mechanic showed up out of nowhere and started working on your Apache like she'd been repairing helicopters her whole life." "Do you remember her name?" Jake asked. "Never got her name, but I'll never forget her face. Hispanic girl, maybe early 20s, spoke broken English but understood helicopters better than our best mechanics. She worked for 3 hours straight with mortars falling all around us, never showed any fear, never asked for help. When your Apache lifted off the next morning, she was gone, like she'd never been there." Peterson paused before continuing. "Captain, I tried to put her in for a Silver Star after the mission, but when I submitted the paperwork, I got a visit from some very serious people who told me the entire incident was classified and that I was to never mention the mechanic again. They said she was part of a special access program and that discussing her involvement would compromise national security." Jake felt his blood boiling as he realized the full extent of the cover-up. Maria Santos hadn't just been reassigned. She had been part of a classified program that used highly skilled mechanics to support special operations missions across Afghanistan. When the program ended, the participants had been given new identities and stationed at regular bases with orders to never acknowledge their classified service. Jake decided that he was not going to allow the Army to continue hiding Maria Santos's heroism. He began preparing a formal request through his chain of command to have Maria's classified service record declassified and her true achievements recognized. But before he could submit the paperwork, Maria Santos approached him with information that would change everything. "Captain Mitchell," Maria said as she found Jake in the base commissary, "I need to tell you something about that night at FOB Chapman. Something that's not in any report, classified or otherwise. Jake looked around to ensure they had privacy before responding. "What is it, Staff Sergeant?" Maria Santos took a deep breath before speaking. "Sir, the reason I was at that outpost wasn't just to fix your helicopter. I was there because my brother was one of the Special Forces soldiers you were supporting. Sergeant First Class Carlos Santos, Alpha Company, 1st Special Forces Group. He was pinned down in that valley, and I knew that if your Apache couldn't fly, he and his team were going to die." Jake stared at Maria in shock as she continued. "Carlos was killed 3 days later in another firefight. But that night at Afubi Chapman, I wasn't just fixing your helicopter. I was trying to save my brother's life. The Army doesn't know about the family connection because I enlisted under my married name, and Carlos never knew I was in Afghanistan." The revelation added an entirely new dimension to Maria's story. She hadn't just been a mechanic doing her job. She had been a sister desperately trying to save her brother's life by keeping his air support operational. Her heroism had been motivated not just by duty, but by love and family loyalty. Jake Mitchell realized that Maria Santos's story was even more powerful than he had imagined, and he was more determined than ever to ensure that her sacrifice and service were properly recognized. But he also realized that fighting the Army's classification system would require allies, resources, and a strategic approach that could overcome years of institutional cover-up. The battle to restore Maria Santos's true service record was about to begin, and Jake Mitchell was prepared to risk his own career to ensure that America's hidden heroes received the recognition they deserved. Captain Jake Mitchell's investigation into Maria Santos's classified service record had attracted the attention of some very powerful people, but not in the way he had expected. 3 weeks after his conversation with Master Sergeant Peterson, Jake received a visit from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the elite Night Stalkers unit that had apparently deployed Maria throughout Afghanistan. Colonel Hayes arrived at Fort Hood without advance notice, accompanied by 2 civilian contractors who Jake immediately recognized as intelligence operatives. The meeting took place in a secure conference room, and Jake quickly realized that he had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple case of bureaucratic cover-up. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Hayes began, "your investigation into Staff Sergeant Santos has reopened some very sensitive files that were classified for reasons that go beyond simple operational security." Jake maintained his composure despite the intimidating presence of the intelligence officers. "Ma'am, with respect, Staff Sergeant Santos performed extraordinary service in combat and deserves recognition for her actions. The fact that her service has been classified doesn't change what she did or what she deserves." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her expression serious but not hostile. "Captain, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Staff Sergeant Santos was not just any mechanic. She was part of a highly classified program called Operation Phantom Wrench, a special access program that deployed our most skilled maintenance personnel to support critical missions across Afghanistan and Iraq." The colonel continued, "Maria Santos was selected for this program because she possessed unique mechanical abilities that bordered on the supernatural. She could diagnose and repair aircraft systems that other mechanics couldn't even understand. But more importantly, she could do it under combat conditions that would paralyze most people." Jake listened intently as Colonel Hayes revealed the scope of Maria's classified service. Over an 18-month period, Staff Sergeant Santos participated in over 40 missions across Afghanistan. She saved hundreds of American lives by keeping aircraft operational under impossible circumstances. Her work directly contributed to the success of operations that eliminated high targets and rescued American personnel from behind enemy lines. But then Colonel Hayes delivered the information that explained everything. The program was terminated not because it wasn't successful, but because it was too successful. Maria Santos and the other Phantom Wrench mechanics were performing so effectively that they were beginning to attract attention from foreign intelligence services. The Taliban had put bounties on their heads, and there was evidence that Chinese and Russian intelligence services were trying to identify and recruit them. Jake began to understand the magnitude of what Maria had been involved in. So, the army gave them all new identities and reassigned them to regular duties to protect them from retaliation. Exactly, Colonel Hayes confirmed. But there's more. The decision to declassify Maria's service record and restore her true military history has already been made. The president himself reviewed her case and determined that her heroism deserves recognition, regardless of the security implications. Jake stared in disbelief as Colonel Hayes pulled out a folder containing official documentation. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos is being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during Operation Phantom Wrench. She's also being promoted to Sergeant First Class and offered a position as a senior maintenance instructor at the Army's Special Operations Aviation Training Center. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Colonel Hayes looked directly at Jake with a slight smile. Furthermore, Captain Mitchell, your investigation and advocacy for Staff Sergeant Santos has impressed some very important people. You're being offered a position as a liaison officer between conventional aviation units and Special Operations Command, with a promotion to major and assignment. Fort Campbell. The ceremony honoring Maria Santos took place 1 month later in a secure auditorium at Fort Hood. Although the details of her classified service could not be made public, the Army had arranged for her family, including her brother Carlos's widow and children, to attend the presentation of her Distinguished Service Cross. Jake Mitchell watched with pride as Maria Santos received the recognition she had always deserved. She stood at attention as the citation was read, describing her extraordinary heroism and exceptional technical competence in support of combat operations in Afghanistan. The medal represented not just her individual achievements, but the service of all the hidden heroes who had supported America's military operations without recognition or acknowledgement. After the ceremony, Maria approached Jake with tears in her eyes. Captain, I never expected anyone to remember that night at FOB Chapman, much less fight to have my service recognized. You risked your career to restore my honor, and I will never forget that. Jake smiled and shook her hand. Staff Sergeant First Class Santos, you earned that recognition through your own courage and skill. I just made sure the right people knew about it. 6 months later, Major Jake Mitchell was working at Fort Campbell, helping to improve coordination between regular Army aviation units and Special Operations Forces. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos was training the next generation of Special Operations mechanics, passing on the skills and knowledge that had saved countless American lives in combat. The story of the mystery mechanic who had appeared out of nowhere to save lives under fire had finally been told, even if the full details remained classified. Maria Santos had gone from being a ghost in the official records to being recognized as one of the Army's most decorated mechanics. But most importantly, Maria had learned that heroism is never truly forgotten. It just sometimes takes time for the right person to recognize it and fight for it to be acknowledged. Jake Mitchell had refused to let her disappear into anonymity, and his determination had restored not just her military record, but her faith in the institution she had served with such distinction. The patch on Maria's shoulder, the same patch that had caught Jake's attention that day on the tarmac at Fort Hood, now told a story that the Army was proud to acknowledge. It represented the hidden service of America's unsung warriors, the mechanics and support personnel who kept the nation's most elite forces operational under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Maria Santos had finally received the recognition she deserved, and her story had become an inspiration for every soldier who served in the shadows. knowing that their contributions might never be acknowledged but serving anyway because duty and honor demanded it. Have you ever met someone whose military service was more extraordinary than it appeared? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you believe that our hidden heroes deserve recognition for their service, hit that share button to honor Maria Santos and all the unsung warriors who keep our military strong.